listening to the Bayview Podcast with hosts Andrew Clark and Chris Emery. This is designed to be a discussion on all things life and faith. We hope this serves as a weekly resource and encouragement to you.
What's going on, Bayview? It's your host, Andrew, as always, joined by host Chris.
Hey.
How are you doing?
I'm good, man. How are you doing today?
I am doing well. I am personally excited that the weather is still sunny, but it is colder, and I feel like we've already had this fall conversation, but that just gets me juiced up and excited.
Yeah, it is a little energizing and refreshing a little bit coming out of the heat of summer.
Yep.
No, I agree. It is, and it is a beautiful day outside the studio, I think, because it's black in here, but
Yep.
It feels good to be back here. We release a new episode every week, but, some of you don't know this, maybe you do. We don't record every week necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
We'll double up some weeks. We were off last week, so it feels weird.
Yeah.
That we only took 1 week off from recording, but man, it feels like forever.
Yeah, it feels like it's been a minute.
It
sure.
does.
Yeah.
Like, I've missed it.
Yeah. It's just been a busy season. Fall from a ministry standpoint, and maybe that's why I enjoy it, is because it feels like it gets really busy, but for me and my family personally, like, we fall more into a routine.
Right.
And so in some ways that's pretty enjoyable, but the weeks very quickly get away from you, and even just 1 week off of something, you feel like, man, remember when we used to record a podcast?
Remember way back then. Remember that? That was so good.
It had that vibe to it. So
No, I think you're right. Something about routine, and I know a lot of people feel this way. Like, we love our summers, we love the freedom and everything, but then it kind of feels good to get back in that rhythm a little bit. And so it's good.
Yeah. No, and I think that definitely segues. You just mentioned kind of like being outside and seeing the different changing of seasons. We're blessed to live someplace where we get to see all four seasons, and I think that lends to kind of the next set of kind of spiritual discipline stuff that we're going to be talking about as we continue in this kind of section of conversations, and that is this idea of personal worship.
Yep.
And, one of the things about personal worship is, what does it look like, or what it looks like for you and I to step out and say, hey, thanks, God. And I think we are blessed with seeing the changing of seasons, how we get to see the creator and the artist side of him. And I'm always just personally reminded of, like, in those moments of the changing of the seasons, to step back and be like, man, thanks, God. Like, this is so cool.
Yeah.
And I'm just constantly reminded of how powerful and wonderful. And again, I like talking about the beauty of God and him as a creator. And I think a lot of that plays into this idea of personal worship. And what does it look like, your prayer life, and things like, some of these words like fasting, and some of these ideas of corporate worship versus individual worship. Do I have to sing to be worshiping only? Or even just, again, that idea of I don't like to pray in front of people. Does that mean I can't worship? It's like, no, like, I think that's our goal maybe today is to break down more of what does it actually look like to worship God from a personal standpoint.
And to encourage a little bit, like, hey, you're probably doing well here already, but here's some more tools, here's some more ways, maybe deeper understanding of worship, because I totally agree. We hear the word worship, and we quickly and immediately go to this corporate worship scene where we're standing in church, we're singing, and while that is a wonderful form of worship, and it's one that many of us enjoy, that's not the only way of worship. And what we hope is that's not your only time of worship.
Yeah.
Because now what we've done is we've scheduled what is probably about a 20 to 25-minute section of our entire week of here's my worship here. And that's not how this goes. Worship is something much larger than that. I think that throughout the Bible, it's referred to at multiple levels. I think Paul really kind of lays it out there when he talks about in Romans 12. He says that he urges us to make our bodies a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. So he's like, hey, listen, this is nothing in there said, at 10:30, go worship.
Yeah.
Right? It didn't say that. It said, hey, all right, take your bodies, take your life, take everything in me. Yeah. How do we make that an act of worship? So that's what we want to dig into a little bit here today, just explore that a little bit. maybe share a little bit how we've found that application in our lives, and then again, the word we go to, let it be a resource to you.
Yeah, I really hope it's a relief, because I think I personally got caught up in this idea of worship being standing amongst a group of people and singing, and there was such a relief when it was like, man, that's not the only way to worship. That's not even like there's so many just different ways to do it, like you've said, and that's why I've even learned like praying. One of the roles here at the church is to do announcements and some of that stuff, and I make a big effort to in that prayer. And if you're listening and you attend Bayview, you might catch on to this. Like when I get a chance to pray for that time of worship, like I'll even pray to the point of that it's not just words that we say, but there's actually meaning behind it, because you can sit there and maybe you're not a singer. Maybe the only time you're laying down any vocal tracks is when you're in the shower, and like that's when you sound amazing. But to sing in front of other people, you're like, that's not me. And I'm very similar to that, where like in those corporate worship settings, it can be intimidating and whatnot. And it's like, but there's something powerful about just meditating on the words, like actually thinking about the words we're singing or saying. It's why hymns are so theologically dense and still offer a lot of value today, because there's so much there where it's like, let's just not have it be something you sing, but actually be something you're thinking about. Like have it be meaning when you say them. And so that's where it's like trying to encourage others, like, man, maybe if you can't sing, you can still think on what's happening, like being focused in those moments. But ultimately, and you've already stated this, that it would go beyond the 25 minutes on a Sunday.
Yep.
And so maybe, kind of share what is personal worship? What are some ways that maybe you worship, or maybe steer us in a direction that kind of gets the ball rolling?
Yeah, and that's a pretty deep question. I think it'd be difficult for us just to put down a really well-worded one statement that says this is worship.
Yep.
Because it is so much larger than that. We see it represented in so many ways throughout the Bible. For me, worship has always been this complete moments of focus, surrender, and lifting up of God.
Yeah.
So for me, worship is a complete abandonment of anything that's about me, and this complete surrender to everything that's about Him. And so it's the verse of less of me, more of Him. For me, that's always been kind of the worship. So then leading into my life verse, and I know many of us have life verses. If you don't have a life verse, that's okay.
Yep.
You're not a bad Christian. If you have a life verse and it's tattooed on your arm, awesome. It doesn't make you a better Christian. But my life verse has always been 1 Corinthians 10:31 of whatever you do, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God. And so that kind of lays in there like, hey, everything about us should be in this mindset, this heart set of glorifying God as our pursuit.
Yeah.
Not that we perfect it, not that we do it, on the mark every time. So personal worship for me then is, okay, what Paul is saying, my life is a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing. So now I begin to apply that. How am I holy and pleasing in the different aspects of my life? So how am I holy and pleasing to God in my life as a husband, in my life as a father, as a neighbor, as a driver down the road, as a shopper at the grocery store, as I go to work. Now it gets into all these areas. Now it's like, whoa, wait. Yeah, that's what Paul was saying. Whatever you do, you do it all to the glory of God. You do it all as an act of worship, this offering back to Him. So for me, that's kind of been how it's always resonated in me, and it's been my goal.
Yeah.
That I've probably done pretty well a couple times here or there.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to maybe the idea of, you or I from the stage when we talk about like living a life as an example for others, that others would see you as, a follower of Jesus. And I really do think that comes from this idea of like living your life as an act of worship. The idea of whatever you do being holy and pleasing. And so I definitely feel it. You talk about being a father or being a husband or better driver. It's like, maybe this is just me, but it's like, if I feel like I've messed up as a father, like I've overreacted in a moment, or like I've, something to do with discipline or something like that, and like there's that conviction almost of like, wow, that wasn't the right thing to do,
right.
or that wouldn't have made, that wasn't holy and pleasing to God. Like that idea of being able to go back and like apologize or correct or learn from, and then hopefully like as there's a continual pursuit of worshiping him and having my life be more of that. And again, just the example of being a better father, like that would become more and more pleasing to him, of how I'm loving in the same way that he would love me, and offering a forgiveness and grace, but also, there's that idea of discipline and whatnot. And so, yeah, I think that's the best way though, what you've just said of like, when we use that language of how to be an example, it really is your life showing, that you're grateful for who God is and what God has done.
And did it point to God?
Yeah.
We've had this conversation before that you mentioned hymns and the theological soundness of many of the hymns, certainly not every hymn. My hit list of hymns that should never be sung. I won't even mention. I won't even mention.
On a hill.
I wasn't even going to mention. I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Yes.
Sorry.
I've got a mansion over the hilltop. Stop singing that song. It's so theologically out of whack. I'm sorry. If that's one of your favorites, I'm sorry. Just sing it loud, whatever. But, one thing because we do work with our worship department here to kind of look into the theology of any of the songs we sing. And one of my go-tos has always been, if the song is using the word I so much, at some point I feel like it crosses the line of like, okay, who am I singing to here?
Yeah. So
if it's all about me, this and about me, well, I'm just singing loud about myself. That's not worship.
Yeah.
So we look for songs that point to God, point to Jesus.
Yeah.
So that applies then now to our life. Like, okay, so did my life today point to me, or did I point people to Jesus? Did I point people to my abilities or to his glory? Did I point people to my accolades or to him being edified? So now, that's kind of what worship is every day, everywhere we go.
Yeah.
Whether we're together or alone.
Yeah.
And there's different forms, and I think you already mentioned one, mentioned like meditation, prayer, fasting. There's all the the Bible's so deep and full of things to dig into in that area. But yeah, I think in the big ballpark, that's worship.
Yeah.
Who am I living to? Who am I singing to? Who am I living to?
Yeah. Yeah. So good. Do you feel like, for maybe the idea of worship, and we can kind of start to dive more into some different aspects of it, but for worship as a whole, like, I don't think you would say there's one true form of worship. It really is how you live your life, in the sense of, is that so? Correct me if I'm wrong. That's even down to like, if I play a sport, or if I, how I cook food, or like any of that kind of stuff. All those things can be done in a way that is worshipful to God. And what does that look like?
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned sports. So, you and I both played college soccer, and athletics and sports have been and continue to be a big part of our lives. And so I can think of a lot of times where I was in the heat of competition, and I'm super competitive now. My kids will tell you I'm still that way. I love to win. I was not the dad that just let my kids win to make them feel good. They have to earn it.
Yep.
And
if I did stuff with my dad and I started crying or whining, he just would play harder.
Yes. It's good fathering.
Yeah.
But there were times in the heat of competition, I know that, I would say things, I would talk trash, I would be, extra harsh in ways. And, we call it sportsmanship, right? So I'd be a bad sport. Well, I'm being a bad worshiper.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, so maybe you're listening, and maybe you love to go out down to the YMCA and play pickup basketball, or maybe you're one of those pickleheads and you love some good pickleball. And well, how did you do today on that? How did you walk away from that? You can be competitive and still be worshipful in the way. I'm not saying go out there and pray before every hit or over spiritualize it, or don't be one of those people. But yeah, of course it does. Of course it applies to that.
Sure.
How did I go shopping today? If I had to go to the grocery store and get some things, did I Did I barrel through? Was I frustrated and irritated at people? Was I short with the cashier because they weren't moving fast enough? Or did I do what I was there to do and at the same time find ways to be kind and see people and just I see opportunities maybe that God put. Well, now I'm worshiping while I do anything.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it applies at so many levels for us is and this is you and I are both pastors. This is the great, I don't say challenge or struggle, but this is part of our constant push. And that is that this Jesus thing, it must infiltrate every aspect of who you are. This cannot be something you do.
Yeah.
This cannot just be something because I go to church, because I stop. That's not it at all. It's like, man, this Jesus thing, it completely transforms every aspect. One of the earliest forms of worship we see in the Bible was with Cain and Abel, when they were both asked to bring an offering to God. Well, offering is a form of worship.
Yeah.
Well, they both brought good stuff, but only one was acceptable.
Mm.
And one was acceptable because one was from this genuine place of, here's the very best I've got. The other was like, hey, here's some really good. Nothing about it said that Cain's offering was bad, but it wasn't the best. And it wasn't the heart of, I can't wait to give you the best I've got.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think for me, there's days where I'd have to look back and be like, wow, I gave God pretty good today.
Yeah.
There's other days where it's like, you know what? I think today I really was kind of outside myself. I wasn't worried about me. And I think I gave God my best. And even in my best, it's still going to be imperfect, but I think I gave him my best today.
Yeah.
Which means I probably worshiped him well today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably not the best example, but I do see, like, you always hear of, like, athletes or musicians, and they win the awards and they win all this stuff, and one of their first comments is, all glory to God or thanks be to God. And you're like, you sing nothing close to anything to do with God. Or
you mean when the gangster rapper gets up there and thanks God for give God the glory for his explicit lyrics?
Exactly. But I've never also been like found that to be cringy, because I think it also fits with this idea of, using your abilities that are God-given abilities, and hopefully you're using them to glorify God.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something about recognizing the fact of, wow, I'm able to do this because of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I think having that mentality while doing it, like it hopefully makes you a better sportsman, have better sportsmanship, and maybe it makes you really contemplate the lyrics you write or how you act or the roles you take, or again, if we start just getting more down to the basics of life, of how you father and how you mother and how you are a spouse, like I think when we're constantly reminded of that, of just like, man, I'm able to do this because of God. This is not on my own strength. Like when we talk about genetics and how hard they've worked and all, it's like, still comes back to the fact that you were created by a God,
right,
who created you in his image, and who, and so just living out those God-given abilities to the best of your ability, like, I don't know, I don't find it off-putting at times, as weird as it sounds when you see the gangster rapper or whatever making those comments, because like at some level, genuine or not, that recognition, and I think more or less that's what I'm trying to say for us in our daily life, that recognition of, man, I get to do this because of God. Like that is such an amazing moment that is worshipful to him. That's giving him that praise of like, this is only because of him.
And obviously I know what you're saying, if it's heartfelt, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure some of it's lip service. But I think you watched it. I know I watched it. The recent documentary on the Florida Gators football and Tim Tebow, and everybody knows Tim Tebow. Everybody knows he's one of the most outspoken athletes about his faith, and he's taken his licks over the years, and kneeling Tebow and all that, but he never wavered from any of that. But during that documentary, I think what jumped out to me was not the things I already knew. I already knew that he put Bible verses on his blackout eye patch. I already knew that he knelt. I mean, we see all those things, but it was talking to some of his college teammates, and they were talking about that from the first time he stepped on campus, that he was very clearly set himself apart from the normal locker room shenanigans of stuff. That they would maybe talk about going to strip clubs or looking at porn or whatever like that. And Tim lovingly and respectfully, but very boldly and firmly, refused to allow himself to be pulled into that. And these big football players, they had mad respect for that, even if they didn't agree with it. And to me, the fact that he took that stand in the locker room, that means so much more to me than him kneeling on the field before 80,000 people.
Yeah, 100%.
Because that, I mean, it's all worship.
Yeah.
But that shows, all right, now that's the heart of worship.
Yeah.
That's something genuine from deep down. That's personal worship.
Yeah.
Of saying, no, I'm going to honor God in all of these areas. And nobody would have known. Mm-hmm. Nobody would have known if he, but that's not what he was about. He was about this living sacrifice of his life that was that was pleasing and honoring to God.
Yeah. His motives were genuine.
100%.
And pure. And I think that does lead into this idea now of maybe like some different forms of worship that are more like applicable and things that I think we just naturally kind of do, but things that are just like our prayer life. Like, how can that be a form of worship?
Yeah. Well, I mean, do this for me. You threw this at me. What's prayer? Like, how would you define prayer? If somebody came up and they have no Jesus background, they're what is praying? How would you give that to them in layman's terms?
I really think it's a conversation with God. That to me has been the easiest way to explain it to a student or whatnot, because I think so often it's tied up into the fold your hands and bow your head and close your eyes and no looking around, and there's all these like almost things you can put to it. And I remember being in high school and I was helping out with a like this retreat, this like camping ministry called North Shore Outdoor Ministries, and they had a group from Ohio come visit. And so it was during the summer, and I was just kind of helping the person running it, and this youth group from Ohio showed up, and they were doing some day camp stuff all throughout the week up here in Traverse City. And the first night we were hanging out and around the bonfire is this camping ministry, like I said, and all of a sudden I hear this one guy, and he's like literally looking at the person next to him, and he kind of turns, and he's eyes open, his head's up, he's just all of a sudden he's like, yeah, God, I just really thank you for today. Like, this was just a crazy day. And like everyone else, the conversation kind of died down, and everyone else kind of just sat there, but still like some people were staring at the fire, other people were kind of still whispering to each other, and he has this full on, like, it felt like he was looking at the face of God having this conversation. Cool. And I remember thinking, and like I was just so blown away by that moment, because I think I had subconsciously accepted it to pray. Like, I had to close my eyes and I had to bow my head and all that kind of stuff. And they just had this, it was such a pure example of like, no, to prayer is to really have a conversation with God. Mm-hmm. There is something to really just talk. So I think we could say, like, there's something too, if you're in your car, like, keep your eyes open, but if you get that time, pray, like, have that conversation. Yeah. I try to teach the students Acts prayer, which I'm sure you've heard of, but the ACTS, so adoration, so almost starting with like praising him for who he is. Then it goes into the idea of confession, where you kind of take that time to say, hey, God, this is how I've messed up, or I needed to say this out loud to you. Then there's like thanksgiving, which is then just the idea of like what you're actually thankful for, so the things he's done in your life. And then supplication, which is a fancy word for like praying on someone's behalf. So that's almost the requests that then happen. And using that as like a very basic but I think full form of prayer is a great place to start. But yeah, it is just having a conversation.
I like that, and that is true, and that means so many things on so many levels. And you said something really cool at the beginning of this podcast, is that you hope this is freeing or maybe affirming, like maybe it just helps you relax. Yeah. Hey, I'm sure I've had people, I don't know how to pray. Yeah, you do. Yeah. I get it. You may not want to pray in front of people. That's fine. Yeah. But you know how to pray because you know how to talk. Just talk to God. Just tell him. Yes, tell him your needs. That's a big part of it. Give him thanksgiving. Tell God how you're feeling. Yeah. I mean, just be honest with him. One, he's a big boy. God can take it. Two, he knows already. He knows what's in your heart. He knows where you're at. But just talk to him. Just tell him. And I've done that. I've driven down the road talking to God, and I'm sure there's times where I look like a a crazy person because I'm literally talking out loud driving down my car. Of course, now we get ticketed if we have our phone, so they probably think I'm just on my speakerphone anyway. But I think that's a great way to look at it. It's a conversation with God about who He is, about what He's done, about where you are, and about what you need.
Yeah.
You know,
and it's when I've always tried to, and I was not always like this, but I've always tried to take that stance of, I want to make sure when I'm praying to God, like, He doesn't need me to, but I want to remind Him of who He is, like of how great He is and who He is first, because so often prayer, we have to be very careful that we don't just view Him as the genie in a bottle. And only time I talk to Him, like, it's like, you can't, it is not a relationship with your parents, right? If you only ever go to them when you're asking them for something.
Right.
And in the same way with God, if the only time we're going to have a conversation with Him is, hey, God, it's me again. Could you do this, 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 this? It's like there's something to, you know, hopefully a relationship is built, in the relationships you have with the people around you are built on the idea of knowing them, knowing what they're about, knowing who, you know, what they've done. Like there's some depth there. And then I think the other key to prayer is it's been the words, I think, tend to confuse people. And that idea of like when you break it down to the basics, just having a conversation, it's like you don't need the big fancy words. God's not up there with this checklist of did they say this, did they say that, right? Did they use these words? Like he's not looking for those things. Like I like I said, what was so mind blowing about that prayer I heard so many years ago was I really thought the person was talking to their best friends. Like the way he was saying things and how he was saying it. Sounds like right here, right now, you and I just talking. Like I was just, it was almost like, wow, you can say, hey, God, what's up?
Yeah.
Like you can say that. Like it was such a weird, like, it was so obvious, but I never really seen it or heard it so genuine. And it was like, wow, that's what we're asked to do.
Yep.
Is that we would just have a conversation that's real, genuine, and who we are.
Yeah. And I know growing up for me, I always felt this pressure, and I'm not saying you put it on me, but growing up in church, always around people like, well, you know, every morning I pray for an hour, you know, I get on my knees. And listen, there are prayer warriors that's what they do.
Yeah.
And rock on. Thank you for your prayers. There are prayer warriors like that praying for you and I and our ministry all the time. We need that. I covet that so much. But I always felt the pressure like, well, if I don't do it that way, I must not be doing it right. Or I must not, you know, I'm not making God happy, or I'm not doing it. I don't know what I'm doing. And that's just not the truth. I mean, prayer is just, you just need to, one, it goes back to why this is part of worship. Is like, okay, just you and God.
Yeah.
Sit down and have a conversation.
Yeah.
Have some time together, whether you're driving on the road, whether you're standing in the shower, you know, 5 minutes of just quiet standing there, just acknowledging Him, or sitting out back. You know, this morning I sat out back. It was kind of a cool, crisp morning. I sat outside for about 5 minutes this morning, just with my cup of coffee, just kind of, it was just like kind of what you're talking about, in the beauty and just the calm. And I found myself just, wow, thank you, God, that I have this backyard to sit in.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wow, this is huge that you've blessed me with this moment to sit here. That's prayer. Yeah. So, you know, Paul says pray without ceasing. And I don't think that means that, you know, go in there and find your prayer closet or wherever that is, or whatever you got, and be there for hours. It's what you said. So out throughout the day, I'm talking to God. I'm checking with God. Yeah. Hey, man, I need your help here. Hey, thank you for this. Hey, my bad. Sorry about that. Forgive me for that. That was a poor reaction, or whatever. Yeah. This is constant conversation, because that's why we pray. I've been asked that question. I know you have. All right. The Bible tells us that God knows what we ask before we ask it. He knows our needs. You know, why pray? Because it honors Him. Yeah. It pleases Him. It matters to Him. And He told us to. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. And I the reason I use the word conversation then is because in that you're not called to just do all the talking either. Yep. There's value in listening. There's value in that time spent where even, you know, maybe this morning for you it was just like, wow, God, thank you. But then you just stopped and you listened and you waited. And maybe that was a moment when there was some kind of like, you know, I've never heard the audible voice of God by any means, but just saying that, like that idea of if you don't always have to be the one doing the talking either. There is something about that is actually really powerful about just the listening portion of it, and just to sit in silence and solitude, and to really be in a moment where it's like, you used the word focus much earlier about when you talked about worship. It's like, I think that's a huge thing within prayer. Like, I know I'm assuming, and maybe this is just a known thing, but I feel like that's why we teach little kids to bow their heads and close their eyes and fold their hands. It's so they're focused, so they're not looking around and being distracted, because there's something that is really valuable about in that prayer time that you would just focus in, you would listen, you would appreciate the silence, and you'd appreciate the time of hopefully alone time, where there's a little fun church word that is the thing, alone time with God. But that's why we use the word conversation, because it goes both ways, and this idea of just being able to listen.
Is silence easy for you, or is it hard for you?
It's gotten easier. I covet silence now.
Yeah.
Because I have kids. But no, I have found that it throws my wife off, where she'll come outside in our garage and I'll be working out with no music on. And she's like, this just is weird. And it's just me out there sweating. But I'm just like, that there's a silence that's there that I'm like, not all the time. I'm like, I just need that moment.
Yeah.
Like some car rides home to the office or back, or if I know I'm going to be alone, like, I'll tend to turn the music down or turn it off, like, just for those little moments. And it's not all the time. I don't necessarily, like, I use the word covet, so I don't necessarily seek it out, but I don't shy away from it when it can happen.
Right.
Because life is loud. Kids or no kids, life is loud, and it's busy and it's full, and the idea of just not having to have noise like, so basically just not being scared of the silence.
Yeah. No, I agree. I'm in that same boat. It's not something that I've just always naturally done, but I've come to greatly appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I've gotten better at putting it into my life intentionally. And man, when I do, I'm kind of that same, like, man, I really, really enjoy this.
Yeah.
Thank you. And it is, and it is, I guess, a form of worship. It is part of our prayer, because we're having that conversation, and now I'm in a listening posture.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I had the chance to be down in Asheville, North Carolina at Billy Graham's The Cove, which is just this beautiful training and discipleship facility. And there is a chapel that he and his wife built there, and just this beautiful rock church building in the middle of the woods. And we had the chance to go in there and just spend some time, and we were kind of given that instruction, like, hey, just be. There's no music, there's no conversations. It was just sit there and be. And I just remember sitting there for quite a while, and I don't specifically remember or feel that I heard any specific instructions from God.
Yeah.
I didn't hear his voice. It did not give me any new life direction. I was not given any great revelations. I just remember sitting there enjoying his presence. That was it. No words being said, nothing like that. I just sat there, and he sat there with me, and we just were. And that was just that was just a really special moment that I remember, of like, wow, this is cool.
Yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite things is been when I go on longer runs, I tend to not take music anymore, and I just no headphones, no nothing. And so it's like, as I'm running by myself, it is just like, I start listening to my breathing, and I start listening to, like, the tapping of my feet, and, like, the rhythms that are happening, and, like, trying to get all that stuff in line. I found such clarity in what is basically this moment of silence. And it's found some of my best prayer times, my best, message prep times, and things like that have just been in those moments where, like, there's some intentionality behind, like, no, I don't need to listen to something right now. I just need to, like, be and focus on what's kind of going on internally, and what am I thinking about, and are there things that I've been holding on to that I need to give to God, and to really use that time to be, kind of like a special sacred time, even if you want to call it that, because it's just time spent essentially in worship, and I don't know, that's been just so fun. I've done it even, like, some Sunday mornings before I've preached or things like that, where just like, man, it just starts with, God, what do you got? And then it was just to go and sometimes it's nothing. Other times there's been moments when it's like I've found like the missing piece to something, to some, sermon I've written or something that's just like, wow, like that's, I don't know. It's just fun.
That's good. Well, I think that is, I think that puts it back into such a everyday existence for us.
Mm-hmm.
Is just recognizing how much of this can come into play. So prayer, worship. There's a couple other things that we read in the Bible that either we shy away from or maybe we just lack understanding. I remember my very first year in youth ministry, I had this cool idea that I would have all the students bow their head and I would read a biblical story, and I told them to close their eyes and let themselves go to the place where Jesus was. And it sounded like a great idea, and I think it really was, actually. I think I was brilliant before my time. But I had a youth leader who was a parent there. She's wigging out, and she's walking around telling kids to open their eyes, don't do this. And she came to me afterwards, and she was just all off her rocker, because she's like, you were teaching them meditation. I'm like, well, I didn't use that word, and I was too young to really push back.
Yeah.
Looking back, I'm thinking like, wait a second. Yeah, I think I probably was. Meditation's biblical.
Yeah.
It's just typically when we hear the word meditation, we think of a calming self-discipline practice. It's associated with Buddhism typically, and saying our Oms and all that. And so there's certainly a very worldly, new age version of meditation, but the Bible says, meditate on my word, meditate.
Yeah.
So how do you, what does that mean to you? And maybe how does that come into practice? If you don't use that word, how does meditation come into play in your personal worship?
Yeah. It goes back to the word we've been saying a little bit here, focus. Like, to me, to meditate is to focus in on something. And so, like, I think I even do it while I'm running, where, like, I start to, like, focus in on, like I said, the pattern of my feet hitting or the pattern of my breath, and, like, just seeing all those different things. And it kind of helps you become more present, in my opinion. So even in my, like, time of reading the Bible in the morning and the study I kind of go through in the morning, it ends with, a moment of prayer, and then I spend the rest of the day trying to focus, meditate, think on what I read that morning, and the new thing learned, or the maybe something that keeps being reiterated, right? Again, another pattern or something I'm beginning to see. And so for me, that idea of to meditate, or that word, really just means more about focus, or to focus in on, or to have it at the forefront of your mind. And so that becomes more of something that's kind of a bigger deal, and then just kind of letting your mind wander wherever.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think meditate, it's a deep focus and really commitment to that. So meditation, fasting.
Yeah.
We hear that word. We've had some conversations even today with some of our staff when we were bringing that up, and like, well, is fasting just food? Is fasting multiple things? I know many of you listening, maybe you practice Lent, whether you're Catholic or not. And Lent is an extended fast from something. The Bible talks about fasting.
Yeah.
It talks about it typically almost exclusively in relation to food.
Yep.
But the Bible actually never does give the command to fast. So there's never this pressure to say, hey, it's right there with, baptism and take the Lord's Supper. It's not that, but the Bible gives instruction. It highlights it as it can be a very, very powerful tool and practice in the walk of a Christian. So have you fasted? How's that played a role in your life?
Yeah.
How have you experienced that?
Yeah, we see fasting is at Matthew 4, where we see Jesus fast, when he goes in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, and he's tempted by the devil. And really we're seeing Jesus is kind of in these preparatory moments of, or days leading up to kind of his full ministry experience is about to happen. And so it's almost in preparation he's fasting. So I've always seen fasting as it's one thing to just be like, oh, I don't eat. Right? Or, oh, I'm not doing this. Or you said Lent, like I'm not doing this for 40 days or whatever it is. the difference to me and what makes fasting is what are you doing in replace of?
Oh, that's good.
So a lot of times I feel like when we see like, okay, I'm not gonna eat breakfast or lunch. I'm only gonna eat dinner for the day. So at 12 o'clock, when you normally would eat lunch, what are you replacing that time with? Is that a time of prayer? Is that a time of worship? Are you spending time reading your Bible during that? Like that to me is what makes fasting of the Bible fasting. Because there's things like intermittent fasting and all this kind of stuff that are healthy, dietary type stuff that, have health benefits here and there that, or just they get the person who's like, I only eat for 1 hour a day or whatever it is. Like there's all those different things that I think are more just straight health related. But I think when we talk about fasting from a form of worship, it is the actual like your motive. Okay. So that what's your focus? Like, why are you doing it? But then whatever it is that you're fasting from, how are you replacing it? What are you doing differently that's hopefully worshipful towards God?
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So it almost is like the question is less what is fasting, but more along the lines of why am I fasting?
Yeah.
But in the Bible, we see fasting driven by different things. Sometimes it's over mourning or grieving, but a lot of times it is over a seeking, whether it's a seeking of God's answer, seeking God's provision, seeking direction. Yeah. There's so many moments where it's or preparation, like with Jesus, and those moments are like, all right, I'm going to go without this in order to seek more of God in this way and more of Him in this area. And I think that's an important part of it. And fasting, it's not something we hear about a ton in our current church culture. I do hear churches, talk about it from time to time.
Yep.
I don't know that I'm a big fan of, I don't know, this is more personal. This certainly is a biblical. I don't know if I'm a big fan of like church-wide corporate fasting, being like, okay, we're all going to fast. But
Sure.
They can, and I've heard great results coming out of that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like, hey, if the Holy Spirit leads you to do that, then you certainly should.
Yeah.
If you're listening, you don't fast or you've never fasted, it's okay. I mean, don't beat yourself up over it. But it is something that we see some really clear evidence of throughout the Bible, that it is part of this, again, back to worship, this seeking Him.
Yeah. It's seeking Him through sacrifice.
100%.
Which again is back to even what we started this whole conversation out with of like as a living sacrifice. Like, so the idea of fasting is you're not partaking in something. You're sacrificing that that thing that is usually beneficial, hopefully, or sometimes like, again, back to your conversation of Lent or some of these things, people are like, oh, I fast from sugar and all that. Like, but again, it comes back to just the motive. Like, is it worshipful, or are you just kind of doing it to do it? Like the intentionality, I think, is so important. And I've seen, at least, there's been benefits to in that time where I'm fasting or not eating or not doing A, B, or C, whatever it is. But like, what am I praying on in those times then? And is that time spent in conversation form, or if I just simply asking God for something? But really trying to turn those moments of going without into going to God with it and really spending that time with Him. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's exactly what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 6. He shows up, he's giving the Sermon on the Mount, and he's preaching to a large group of seriously law-abiding citizens, meaning they all were doing the deeds. They were doing the things by the letter. They were, no, I got that. And he's kind of like, listen, you're missing it. And so he talks about prayer. He talks about fasting. He talks about giving to the needy. He talks about all these things. And the common thread is, hey, don't do it how you're watching these religious people do it.
Yeah.
Don't go out on the street corner and pray out loud using all your big fancy words. That's not what this is about. Just talk to me. Don't go out, and I love what he says about fasting. Don't walk around with that sad look on your face, which means this. If you're led to fast, and maybe you're going to fast for a couple days, or you're going to fast, that means don't get to work and walk through with the, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of weak today. I've been fasting. I'm kind of holy, kind of a big deal. Jesus, like, no, I think Jesus would rather you just not do it.
Sure.
If that's why you're going to do it. He's like, no, just do it in private. This is between you and me, because that's worship. Worship is between us and our holy God.
Yeah.
and that counts through our everyday life. It counts through our interactions with our relationships, our families, our spouses. It matters when we come into corporate worship. So now that changes all of that, because not every worship set is going to check all your boxes.
Yeah.
Not every church is going to do it the way you think they should do it. And I'm not saying don't find a church that you can enjoy your time there. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that be careful that you're not going in looking for a worship experience that really builds you up and makes you feel right.
Yeah.
Because that's not what this is about.
Yeah.
Everything about worship is focus, surrender, pursuance of Him. And I think that that's where we come into where this is an everyday existence.
Yeah. So good.
So, well, hey, we really appreciate you spending time with us today. Again, we hope that this was something that encouraged you, gave you some resources, kind of helped you along your way this week, because this is an everyday thing.
Yeah.
And we're happy you joined us today, and hopefully this is a little bit of a help for you. We will be back here next week on the Bayview Podcast. This is Chris. This is Andrew signing off, and we'll see you next time around.